G'day crew. Do you know what you're looking at on the screen at the moment? I expect most of you will know what it is. It's a few screen captures from my sounders. The really important question though, can you interpret what you're seeing and understanding what the bottom looks like and where the fish are holding? There's no fishing in this video, but I think it will be invaluable in helping you to locate the fish. I plan to make a small series of these videos to try and help you understand what you're seeing on your sounders. If you're a real sounder guru, then you may not learn anything. But if you're just an average Joe, this will help you understand what you're seeing on your sounder. If you can't find structure, and if you can't recognise fish on your sounder, then the money you spend on that sounder is just wasted. Don't take this the wrong way. I was catching fish as a kid before I'd even heard about sounders. You can find spots to fish without a sounder, but having done both, I can tell you that having a sounder and knowing how to use it sure makes the job a lot easier. I'm going to deliver this lesson as a series of 3D images. I'll start off by introducing the components of the image so that you can identify them when they're shown together. First of all, there's the boat. Just to orientate the source of the sounder beam, for the purpose of the lesson, I will talk about the characteristics of the Airmar 265LH transducer because that's one of the ones that I have on my boat, so I know it fairly well. Next, we need some fish. In case you're wondering, the 3D models I'm using are tuna. I've placed one at 10 metres deep, another at 50 metres deep, and the last one at 90 metres deep. I've also set the sea floor at 100 metres deep, and the fish are positioned 4.5 metres to the right of the centre line of the boat. The 265LH transducer operates in the high frequency band between 130 kHz and 210 kHz. At those frequencies, the beam width varies between 10 degrees at 130 kHz and 6 degrees at 210 kHz. For this exercise, I'm showing the high frequency cone with an angle of 6 degrees, so we're assuming an operating frequency of 210 kHz. The 265LH transducer can also operate in the low frequency band between 42 kHz and 65 kHz. At those frequencies, the beam width varies between 25 degrees at 42 kHz and 16 degrees at 65 kHz. For this exercise, I'm showing the low frequency cone with an angle of 25 degrees, so we're assuming an operating frequency of 42 kHz. Finally, I'll introduce some rocks on the seafloor to demonstrate how uneven terrain affects the transducer image. I made the rock pile in question about 15 metres high, so the effect will be easier to see when we get to that stage. There's a lot of numbers there, but just bear with it. It'll all become clearer as I assemble the images and explain them. Looking at the 6 degree beam from the high frequency elements first, I hope everyone understands that the beam from a traditional 2D transducer is in the form of a cone, with the apex at the face of the transducer and the base on the sea floor. Over the years I've found that a lot of people I've spoken to don't really appreciate how that cone affects their ability to detect fish. What I mean is that they understand the beam's a cone shape, but they don't really translate that into understanding where the fish is in relation to the boat. In this series of shots, I'm showing rings every 10 metres along the transducer cone so that you can get a visual representation of the area in which the fish can be detected. In other words, a fish that is up close to the boat must be much closer to the transducer in order for it to be detected than one that is down deeper. The greater radius of detection at the deeper depth does come at a price. If you detect a fish up close to the surface, you know its location within very small limits. As you go deeper, the cone expands. Knowing the location of the fish with respect to the transducer becomes more of a problem, because the fish can be anywhere in that circle. Let's look at that in more detail by putting some dimensions on the circles. I'll talk about it to the nearest tenth of a metre. If you want to know the exact figure, you can zoom in on the screen. At 10 metres deep, the cone is 1 metre in diameter. Therefore, the fish has to be inside that circle in order for it to be detected. If you'd followed all that, you'll notice that for a 6-degree beam angle, the beam diameter increases roughly 1 metre for every 10 metres of depth. This conforms to the 1 in 60 rule that's used for aircraft navigation approximations. I won't go into the 1 in 60 rule here, but if you're interested, Google it and it can provide a really good explanation. If you want to get an approximate size of the cone at the seafloor or at any point on the way down, the 1 in 60 rule will give you a rough approximation. Units don't matter, the rule works the same whether you're dealing with centimetres, metres, feet or nautical miles. A 10.5 metre circle at 100 metres deep doesn't sound too bad. If you drop your bait straight down beside the transducer, then there's a good chance that the fish you see on the sounder will detect the bait, and if he's hungry, he'll eat it. The problem is that the ocean is large, and 10.5 metre detection circle is not a guarantee of finding any fish, unless you have a reasonable starting point to begin your search. This slide shows the difference in detection volume between a 6-degree cone in the centre and the 25-degree cone on the outside. In this slide I've cut the outside cone in half to make it easier to see the inner cone. I'm going to go through the same exercise we just did for the 6-degree cone with this 25-degree cone, showing how the rings expand as the beam goes deeper. Since we've already done it once with the 6-degree cone, I'll let this play through at a faster speed. Now let's have a quick look at how each ring expands as the beam goes deeper. Again, 10 metre intervals going down, and remember this is a 25-degree cone, so the rings are going to expand much faster. So as you can see, the wider cone makes it easier to search an area for fish and structure, but the location within the detection area becomes more ambiguous. So there's a trade-off between the ability to cover an area searching for fish and structure against the ability to know where that fish and structure is with some degree of precision when you do find them. As you go deeper, the situation gets worse. The low frequency on this transducer can reach depths of 900 metres in good water conditions. At that depth, the detection circle has expanded to a diameter of over 400 metres. That's nearly half a kilometre in diameter. In order to locate the fish in that area, other methods need to be employed. I'll go into them in a later video. Now just going back to the dimensions we've been talking about and the limiting depth of 100 metres, this is a comparison of the search areas for the 6-degree beam and the 25-degree beam. Now to introduce our fish into the model to illustrate how the beam widths affect your ability to find the fish. The fish is at 10 metres deep and 4.5 metres off to the right of the transducer. As you can see here, the fish is clearly outside the detection area of the transducer. What about the fish at 50 metres and 4.5 metres off to the side of the bait? Will it be detected? No, it won't. Once again, the fish is clearly outside the detection area of that beam. Then there's still the fish at 90 metres and again 4.5 metres off to the right. Do you think we'll detect that? As it turns out, it is in the edge of the beam. It isn't completely obvious in this shot, but I will show you another angle of it later so you can see for yourself. Because the fish is right out near the edge of the beam, it will not show a strong return on the screen, despite being the same size as a fish that is closer to the centre of the beam. Now looking at the same situation with the 3 fish, but this time using a 25-degree low frequency cone. Now the first fish at 10 metres and 4.5 metres off to the side is still outside of our detection cone. Now this time the second fish at 50 metres deep and 4.5 metres off to the right of the transducer is well within the cone of the transducer signal, so it will be detected. The third fish at 90 metres deep is also well within the detection cone of the transducer. So in this case, both fish at 50 metres and the one at 90 metres will show a return on the screen. The return you see on the screen won't be as crisp and clear as you would see with the high frequency beam, because with the low frequency beam you're losing some resolution. That's just the way it works. There's also what's known as the shadow effect on any 2D transducer. In this image of the 6-degree beam, the seafloor is at 100 metres directly below the centre of the transducer. Because the beam diverges at 6 degrees, the signal on the edges of the cone has to travel 100.1 metres to reach the seafloor. The 0.1 metre difference shows as the red line on your sounder, or depending on your colour palette of course. On mine it shows red. The greater the difference in the distance travelled between the centre of the beam and the outer edges of the beam, the thicker that line will appear. This is known as the shadow area of the beam. This slide shows the shadow area of the 6-degree beam at 100 metres depth. What happens with this is that any fish within that shadow area, which is 0.1 metres or about 4 inches deep, cannot be detected. The shadow area for that narrow beam is really quite negligible on a flat seafloor. The situation with the 25-degree beam, however, is somewhat different. Because of the wider angle, the outside edges have to travel relatively further than the centre of the beam, and at 100 metres deep, the outer edges have to travel approximately 2.5 metres further than the centre of the beam. This results in a thicker shadow of approximately 2.4 metres at the edge of the beam. This means the line you see on the sounder for the ocean floor will be about 2.4 metres thick, and any fish in that 2.4 metre section of the beam will not be detected. Everything we've been talking about so far is dealing with a perfectly flat sea floor. Now I want to show you what happens when the sea floor is uneven. To illustrate that, I'll introduce the 3D rock model. Remember that that's on the ocean floor at 100 metres deep and the model's about 15 metres high. So you can think of it as a pinnacle. I'm going to use the same 3 fish in exactly the same locations to see what difference the rock makes to our ability to detect the fish on the sounder. Looking at the 6-degree beam, we can see that nothing appears to have changed with the current positioning of the rock. Looking at it from another angle shows that the 6-degree beam misses the rock, so the reality is that nothing changes on the sounder screen. We still only see the bottom fish at 90 metres, and the rock is entirely outside our cone, so as far as the sounder screen goes, we don't know it's there. The story changes, though, when we look at the 25-degree cone. As you can see in this image, the cone encompasses some of the rock. Looking at it from a different angle, you can see that the edge of the cone meets the highest point of the rock, and the bottom 2 fish are still within the detection area of the cone. Now the depth that the sounder reads is taken from the shortest path from the transducer to the ocean floor, or in other words, the highest point on the ocean floor. Since the rock is 15 metres high and the rest of the ocean floor is at 100 metres deep, one would think that the depth would show as 85 metres on the sonar, but not the case. As I said, the sonar measures the distance from the face of the sonar to whatever object reflects the beam, and it measures that in a straight line. Because the highest point of the rock is detected at the edge of the cone, the actual distance in a straight line is 85.2 metres. Not a big difference, but something that I think is important to understand. Because the sonar now sees the bottom as being at 85.2 metres from the transducer, The remainder of the signal that reaches a full 100 metre depth and is reflected back forms a much thicker red line under the actual seafloor that the sonar shows on the sounder. That is red in my case with the colour palette that I use. What this means is that the return from the fish that is sitting at 90 metres is obscured by the increased thickness of the red line on the sounder. There's an arrow pointing at the fish in case you find it difficult to see on your screen. The effect is what I call the sonar shadow. I've heard others refer to it by that name. In fact, I think it was a salesman who sold my father our first sounder, and just incidentally that was a Furuno sounder back in the mid to late 60s, and he used the term when he was demonstrating how to use it. Now in this slide I've moved the rock closer to the centre of the transducer. The main reason that I moved the rock so I can demonstrate the effect with the 6-degree beam. As you can see, the 6-degree beam cuts the rock. Looking at it from a different angle makes it more apparent that the beam impinges on the rock, as we saw previously with the 25-degree beam. The fish at 90 metres is now in a crevice in the rock, but it is also inside the sonar shadow created when the measured depth at the highest point is less than the depth of the surroundings. What this means is that the 6-degree beam will not detect any of the 3 fish that are in the water column. I'll move the camera angle around just so you can see this from all sides. That's getting towards the end of what I wanted to say. There's been a very long-winded way of saying that you shouldn't rely on either low frequency or high frequency. It's best if you use a mix of the two. The low frequency is going to give you much better ground coverage so you can search for things. The high frequency is going to let you pinpoint exactly where that object is in the water column. Now if you've got a sounder where you can adjust the frequency, you can have the best of all worlds. Now I've got a fair latitude in adjusting the frequency on the TM265LH, so that's what I do. I try and make use of the whole frequency band to assess the conditions and find the fish. Before I finish off the video, I just want to run through a couple of real-world examples of what I've been talking about. This image is from the 2D elements of my Raymarine Axiom Pro that I used to have. It shows what I interpret as a rocky structure on the bottom. As you can see, the red area has thickened because of the multiple levels in the structure. This is the same structure, this time shown using the down vision elements of the Raymarine Axiom Pro sounder. This makes things a little bit clearer, as you can now see the change in shade of the various levels of the structure. Even small details that you can't see at all with a 2D sounder become visible. I'll put both images up for a few seconds so that you can compare the two. Pause the video if you want a longer look. And while you're looking at them, I'll just mention that because the down vision gives you a clearer image of the bottom doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's another tool in your arsenal to help you understand what's going on down there. I was brought up on 2D sounders. Down vision and side vision are quite new to me. They have their uses and they're very good at what they do, but I still turn back to the 2D sounder to get a full understanding. In this section of video, I'm going over a random section of Moreton Bay using the high frequency element of the TM265LH transducer displayed on the Furuno TZ3 screen. The main purpose is to show you the thickness of the bottom line, which is red in the case of the palette that I've chosen to use, on both the high frequency and the low frequency settings. Now that I've switched over to the low frequency band, you can see that the thickness of the bottom line immediately increases. This is a direct result of the increased angle of the beam and the consequent longer travel distance of the outer edges, as I've been discussing throughout this video. I just created a couple of stills from the previous video clip, just as I switched over from the low frequency to the high frequency, so that you can compare them side by side and I can point out some of the differences between the high and low frequencies, apart from the thicker red line. If you look at the school of fish that's visible, it's much clearer on the high frequency image, that is the one on the left, and that's because the higher frequency is capable of better discrimination between closely packed targets. At the time I took this, I had the frequency set at 133 kHz. Had I had it set at the maximum 210 kHz, the beam would have been narrower, the red line would have been slightly thinner, and the fish gill would have been slightly more distinct. The image on the right is from the low frequency elements. Again, I don't have it on the lowest possible frequency. It's operating at 53 kHz, so that the beam isn't as wide as it could be. The red line is slightly thinner and the fish gill is slightly more well defined than it would have been at the lowest possible frequency. But the difference between the high and low frequency is still apparent, and that is what I wanted to demonstrate. Finally, just one more image to demonstrate that a wider cone angle is not always advantageous when it comes to finding fish. It can find structure easy enough, and it can find fish easy enough, but the fish can also be hidden within the sonar shadow, or the dead zone if you prefer that term. A high-frequency narrow beam can often find those fish that are invisible to the low-frequency beam. The ideal situation is to run both high and low frequency side by side on a split screen, giving you the best of both worlds. The Furuno TZ3 and the TM265LH combo does this very well, but other sounders also have the same capability. Learning to make use of all the features of your sounder is well worth the effort. After all, you paid good money for that box of electronics. If you don't use it to its full potential, the money is wasted. Now this is a slide taken from the AirMar webpage, and it shows the specifications for the TM265LH transducer that I've been using as a basis for this video. All transducers are similar. This is just one that I'm familiar with, so I used it. This is another slide taken from the AirMar webpage, and it shows the detection zones of the transducer at the varying depths down to the limit of the high frequency beam. Now, this slide was also taken from the AirMar webpage, and it shows the difference between the detection depth of the low frequency beam and the high frequency beam. The low frequency beam will penetrate the water a lot deeper. There's a lot more I want to say about using a conventional 2D sounder, and I also want to cover down vision and side scan as well as 3D view. To do that all in one video is going to take hours and hours, so I intend to break it up into several smaller videos. I hope you watch them all and learn something from them that will help you catch some more fish. I won't put them out on a regular basis, I'll just put them out in between fishing videos. I'll try to put out one every month or so. In the next video that I do on this series, I want to show you how to determine the bottom hardness using a 2D sounder and a little bit of experience. Until then, good fishing.